for the first 7 years, so the etheric body is a big architect here. And the etheric body works in rhythms of 7 years. So from the moment you're born, your etheric body is really working to create, everything okay?
Oh, no, it certainly is, yeah.
Okay. Your etheric body is working to create its first manifestation of a physical body. Because when you're born, all your substance is from your mother, right? When you're born, you're still the substance of your mother. So the etheric body starts to replace all the substances of your parents. And it takes 7 years for that to happen. Okay. Mm-hmm. At the end of that 7-year period, so Steiner says during that 7-year period, the human being is deeply, deeply, deeply a sense organ. All of its senses, it's just absorbing from the sense world in a very, very existential way. There's not a lot of separation from the world at all. That does gradually happen. And again, we're incorporating this idea of the evolution of consciousness occurring in the child, right? And there are little moments that occur, but for us to go in during those 7 years, Craig, yes, and try to intellectualize, try to force Ahriman's influence as soon as possible, because that's what all learning the alphabet and all that stuff forced on a child, that's what you're kind of doing, is you're Ahrimanizing them, okay? If you do that, Steiner says that what happens is the etheric body is building that organism, but if you ask it to think, it has to pull some of its forces away from what it's doing in order to start to learn the alphabet and in order to learn how to read. And you weaken the primary task that etheric body is actually lawfully supposed to be doing at that time. And so, well, how do you teach then? What would teaching be in the first 7 years? Essentially, Steiner says the child is pure imitation. Through its sense organs, it wants to imitate everything it experiences, especially from human beings. So you bake and you sew and you do artistic activities where the child you just let them do what they want to do in that sense, right? Guided activity, but they want to do it anyway, right? And all that stuff. And so there's a very special thing, and the kindergartens of Waldorf schools are magical. If you ever go into one, they're magical to ever see. Go into one. You know, a lot of people, one of the reasons they send their kids to Waldorf schools is the first time they walk into a Waldorf school, they start to cry. Because
yes.
Because humanity, they realize humanity isn't completely gone from the world yet. That's my feeling about the matter, okay? There's a human place still that exists. Okay, so for those first 7 years, you do a very imitation-oriented edification of the child, but not intellectual. You don't do that. So then around a time of 7 years old, the etheric body completes its first task. And around 7, it finally gets rid of the last remaining substances from the parents, which are your milk teeth.
Wow.
So when it finally starts to push those teeth out and replace them with its own teeth, with you are replaced with your own teeth, Steiner says a clairvoyant can see the etheric body separate. And the part around the head takes on a different cast, so to speak. And in fact, he says that the child's consciousness changes. It doesn't make an aggregated step into another realm. It's a qualitative leap. And it moves into what I will call a morally saturated pictorial consciousness, where it loves to hear stories about right and wrong and good and evil. And it just lives in the right and wrong and the moral with incredible intensity. Okay.
Yes.
And so the teacher has to change all and that's when a child's ready for school, is at the age of roughly 7, or whenever you see the teeth changing. That could be 8 or 9 for slower developers. It might take that long, right? And that's when they're ready to go to a school. Okay. So in a Waldorf school, you bring your kid in, he's 7.5 and his teeth aren't changing. They would probably say, no, you better wait till next year. And you're going like, why? It's a pretty hard answer to give them. You know what I mean? Well, your child's etheric body is, so again, they don't see that, but they're using Steiner's observations as heuristic devices to understand what's going on. You see what I mean?
Absolutely.
I don't know if you call that belief or if you call it an application of working hypotheses. Fair enough? Some believe, others could say, I'm a teacher, I've committed to this, I'm going to do what the ideas are implying. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, but the teacher then has to take all the knowledge you and I understand in an abstract formal operations, to use, I was a teacher for 37 years, okay, kind of thing, and not a Waldorf teacher. I did that for 3. And they have to turn it into mythological, pictorial, artistic activities and try as little as possible to exhaust the human being in a certain sense, like intellectually. You can exhaust us. And again, I mentioned, as those consciousness forces are brought in, they do damage, right? That's why you fall asleep every night. So they have to be treated very well. Okay, so from 7 to 14, Steiners, you have a very ideal place because the etheric body is very powerful during those years, and the astral body has not yet been born. And by the way, Steiner called that at 7 years old, when your teeth are brought out. He says that's when your etheric body is unsheathed, like it's taken out of a scabbard. And you now have, for the first time, your own etheric body.
At 7.
Your own, at 7.
Okay.
Your etheric body is born at 7 years old. Just like your etheric body dies at 3 1/3 days after you die. It takes 3 days after you die for your etheric body to die. It takes 7 years for it to be born when you're born.
That's amazing.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, but think of it as a pedagogical tool. That's so extraordinary, really. So then what's so ideal is because your astral body hasn't been quite born yet, even though it kind of begins, right? It's an ideal time for teaching. And the modus operandi for all teaching is art. Art, everything is done in and through and around and with art. Because you just can contemplate that. To Steiner, art was really the thing that allows the Christ to live strongly between Ahriman and Lucifer in the healthiest way possible, even though he isn't there in anybody's mind or dogmatically mentioned one time. Okay, but that's, shall we say, the operational activity that's going on. So let's just take one tiny idea I've always loved. So I've got a piece of clay in front of me. Okay, just amorphous, nebulous piece of clay. And I've got an idea in my head that I want to see manifest in that physical form. And so my thumb goes, okay, I'm going to begin this. And it pushes into the clay. And then I step back. I go, well, okay, that's not exactly what I wanted to happen. But okay, that's a beginning. And then you see again, because things just changed. So you see again and you change your understanding, you go back in again, right? And this conversation with earth, this conversation with matter, and with this brilliant, imaginative, living imagination that you're working with in your consciousness are interacting. My eyeballs are too big right now, sorry, right? Are interacting, and you are creating something on there, right? That's, you want to do that in math, in history, in geography. You want to do that in everything. That's what a master Waldorf teacher will do. Now, here's the other thing. A Waldorf teacher stays with their same class for all 8 years, from the first grade to the 8th grade, and builds a human relationship with them that constantly changes because the child's consciousness is changing to beat the band. Incredibly powerful, but very problematic at the same time if you've got a dysfunctional teacher, if you've got a situation that just doesn't work. And there's nothing ideal here we're talking about. I mean, everything is ideal that we're talking about, but the reality is still something that's enormously, it isn't a job, it's a calling. That's where the word, might say, being a Waldorf teacher is a calling, right? It's not really a job. If it is, it doesn't last for long, I don't think, right? Because of the demands. Okay, so then what happens? Another 7-year period. This is kind of amazing when you think about it. So another 7 years happens, and then what happens? Well, at 14, what happens to us? Our astral body, our astral body is born. Isn't that cool?
At 14, okay.
Yes.
And then we
call it puberty. Sure, your passions, your instincts, all that stuff just explodes hormonally into your consciousness. You start trying to think logically, right? And all that stuff, and you're working with logic now in a way that's comical sometimes with kids, but amazing to see, right? And then there's the high school, and that's when the subjects differentiate, the teachers differentiate, becomes more like a regular school. Then at 21, another 7-year period, Steiner says, is when actually the ego finally truly incarnates in the body. But you're not really born until you're 21. And we used to call that coming of age. The time of coming of age is an old phrase. So your ego, what happens? Well, your think of it. You had to have an etheric body to live on the earth. You didn't have one until you were 7. You had to have an astral body to live on the earth. You didn't have one until you were 14. And now when you're 21, the ego has these bodies in which to incarnate into and begin to interact with them and begin to organize them. Steiner says even begin to purify them. So he says, so we have these 7-year cycles. So the 7-year cycle from 21 to 28 years old is when the ego turns back on its own astrality, its body of instincts and passions and desires. And if it's had a good education, it strives to purify its impulses, to ennoble its astrality.
Mm.
And it will accomplish however much of it will accomplish, either through the blessings of a beautiful incarnation or through the sufferings of a very difficult incarnation. It doesn't matter. Whatever you needed karmically, right? Whatever you needed through your karma to grow, you're going to get. And none of it's bad, even though it's going to be really, really, really hard for some people, right? And I don't have the answers for why. Now, that again does not forgive human beings that have a good, just looking at people in horrible circumstances and going, oh, that's too bad, that's their karma. Forget all that logic. That is evil, dark, rot gut logic, okay? It has nothing to do with the, shall we say, the Christ and the caring and the loving and the of everybody on the whole earth, okay? That's number one, got to be understood. Okay, so then there's, again, successive 7-year periods that get harder and harder to really pin down because all the transformations are more and more becoming of a soul nature. More and more are inner transformations occurring, okay? And this goes back to this evolution of consciousness. We're seeing a little bit of that. Okay, so the teachers are always involved in this. They know that when they go to sleep at night, if they meditate on their children before they go to sleep, that they'll be with them in the astral world during sleep. And they can even continue being their teacher there. So the picture of a Waldorf teacher is massive, okay? Way beyond what you and I would call an educator in that sense, right? And who knows what the karma is. So anyway, that's education. We talked about the Christian community. Steiner also gave lectures for agriculture. Have you heard of those? Biodynamics. And that was all based on clairvoyance. And seeing that the earth is a living being that has its own physical body. The earth has its own etheric body. The earth has its own astral body. And since the year 0, the earth has had its own ego.
It's good to see in your life where you are in those rhythms. And I've always found the one between 21 and 28, that rhythm oftentimes to be where a lot of people's growth stops. If you notice, most people are somewhere between 21 and 28 the rest of their whole life.
Wow.
You know,
is that your own observation?
That's just my observation.
You want to hear Steiner's observation on that?
What was it? Yes.
This will blow your mind, man.
I'm ready.
This is a cool one. You didn't even ask a question. I love this. Okay. So Steiner said that if you go back, the evolution of consciousness, if you go back, let's say 6,000 BC or 5,000 BC, okay, think about this. Every 7 years that you and I live, at the end of that 7-year period, a massive change in consciousness occurs. As I mentioned, that moral pictorial consciousness at 7, then the formal operations, logical thinking at puberty, besides everything else that happened at puberty. Those are massive changes of consciousness, and they occur out of the organic nature of your body. You don't do anything for those. They're free, right?
Yes.
And even at 21, that one is still something that happens to you. You don't really do anything for it. It's part of the lawful unfolding of the organism that it bestows these transformations of consciousness. Well, Steiner says if you go back in time, you'll find that this continued all the way up until you were in your 50s. Every 7 years, a massive change in your consciousness would occur. Now, I can't characterize them. I don't know what he's talking about. He just says it happened. So that when you were in your 40s and 50s, you had a wisdom in your organism that everybody saw. Everybody that saw you and they were younger and they saw you, you were 55, they knew you knew more because you did know more. Because your organism had bestowed a form of consciousness on you at that time that gave you literally more knowledge. He says, and what has happened to humanity is that with each successive epoch, we're growing younger and younger. He says, and what he meant by that is that bestowal through a 7-year rhythm, that bestowal of a new consciousness has gotten earlier and earlier and he says, in our time, around 27 years old, after 27 years old, those forms of consciousness are not bestowed through your organism anymore. And the only way you can continue to evolve yourself is through your own awareness, through your own work, through knowledge of higher worlds. So when people don't, they're 27 for the rest of their lives. There you go.
Yes, there you go. I love it.
Let's even go 22 or 21. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, so I've always thought about 23 seems to be it. Yes. Keep going.
He says that if you go further in the future, there'll be an epoch where we will not get to 14.